On September 26, 2025, the world's attention focused on the United Nations in New York, where Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu delivered one of his most hard-hitting speeches in years. Addressing the UN General Assembly, Netanyahu warned that recent international moves to recognize a Palestinian state sent a dangerous signal. His words were blunt, even shocking to many in the chamber and around the globe. In a line that dominated headlines within minutes, Netanyahu declared, "You know what message the leaders who recognized a Palestinian state this week sent to the Palestinians? It's a very clear message. Murdering Jews pays off." That single sentence captured his frustration and his warning. It also ignited a firestorm of reactions, applause from some, condemnation from others, highlighting once again the bitter divides over the decades-long Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Prime Minister's speech came during a tense session convened to review the faltering peace process. For Netanyahu, the timing of several Western governments' recognition of a Palestinian state, among them Ireland, Norway and Spain, just days before the UN gathering was, in his view, a serious mistake. He framed it as not merely symbolic, but as a move that, in his words, rewards violence and undermines prospects for genuine negotiations. As he spoke, cameras captured the faces of delegates from across the world. Some looked stunned, others quietly nodded. The reaction inside the Assembly Hall mirrored the mood outside it. Across Europe and the Middle East, protests and rallies erupted. Supporters of Palestinian recognition hailed it as a step toward justice and long-denied self-determination. Israeli officials and Netanyahu's allies, by contrast, portrayed it as reckless diplomacy that could embolden extremists. Netanyahu's critics accused him of using inflammatory language at a moment when diplomacy needs care and restraint. But his supporters argued that his warning reflected Israel's deep concerns, that granting political legitimacy to the Palestinian cause at this stage might encourage further attacks and harden positions against peace. Western leaders who championed recognition insisted their decision was aimed at supporting moderate Palestinian voices and reviving the two-state solution, a vision of peace that has been on life support for years. They dismissed Netanyahu's accusation as an unfair reading of their intentions. They argued that the failure of peace talks, repeated cycles of violence and the stagnation in negotiations have only strengthened militant factions. For them, recognizing Palestinian statehood was an attempt to shift momentum toward a negotiated settlement. The United Nations leadership urged both sides to step back from inflammatory rhetoric. The Secretary-General emphasized that the path to peace lies in dialogue, not in deepening divisions. Yet the day's events demonstrated how far apart the two sides remain, not just on the issues of borders and security, but even on the basic question of how to interpret the actions of the international community. In Israel, Netanyahu's remarks were met with applause from his political base. His cabinet members echoed his message, calling the recognitions by Western democracies premature and dangerous. Opposition voices within Israel, however, expressed concern that the Prime Minister's words would further isolate the country and alienate key allies at a critical time. In Ramallah, the seat of the Palestinian Authority, leaders rejected Netanyahu's remarks as provocative and misleading. They argued that recognition by Western states was not about rewarding violence, but about acknowledging the Palestinian people's right to statehood, a right they say has been delayed for far too long. They accused the Israeli leader of inflaming tensions to deflect from the failures of the peace process. This moment at the UN cannot be understood in isolation. It is part of a decades-long story of missed opportunities, broken negotiations, and cycles of mistrust and bloodshed. The Oslo Accords of the 1990s promised a roadmap to peace, but ultimately failed to deliver a permanent solution. The Second Intifada in the early 2000s, with waves of violence and reprisals, further eroded trust. Subsequent efforts by successive US administrations and other mediators often stalled or collapsed amid renewed conflict. For Israelis, security concerns have always been paramount. Repeated attacks, rocket barrages, and the threat of further violence shape their politics and make concessions difficult. For Palestinians, the occupation, the expansion of settlements, and the lack of progress towards sovereignty fuel frustration and despair. These competing narratives have locked both sides in a cycle of mistrust that international diplomacy has so far failed to break. The new wave of recognitions by European countries reflects a growing impatience in parts of the world with the stalemate. Over 140 UN member states have recognized Palestine since 1988, but the decisions by major Western democracies mark a significant change in the political landscape. To many Israelis, however, it feels like an erosion of their diplomatic standing and a sign of increasing international isolation. Netanyahu's words at the UN highlighted Israel's fear that these recognitions, far from encouraging moderation, could embolden hardline elements and reduce incentives for the Palestinian leadership to engage in direct talks. His speech framed the issue as not just a diplomatic dispute, but as a matter of security and national survival. Reporters outside the UN pressed Netanyahu's aides for clarification. Would Israel consider re-engaging in talks under new conditions, or would it respond with tougher policies? Officials insisted Israel remained willing to negotiate, but only if, as one advisor put it, the talks are realistic and ensure Israel's security. They argued that international recognition without direct agreements undermines that process. For decades, Israel has shown it can reach historic agreements with its neighbors when security conditions allow. The peace treaties with Egypt in 1979 and with Jordan in 1994 remain cornerstones of regional stability. But progress with the Palestinians has repeatedly stalled, often collapsing in the face of violence, political upheaval, or disputes over borders and the status of Jerusalem. The current debate at the UN reflects not just a policy disagreement, but also the deep emotional scars of this conflict. For Israelis, the memory of past attacks and the sense of vulnerability run deep. For Palestinians, decades of occupation and displacement have bred frustration and resentment. The words of leaders, amplified on global stages like the UN, often sharpen those divides. On the streets of Jerusalem and Ramallah, reactions to the speech were mixed. Some saw Netanyahu's remarks as a necessary defense of Israel's right to protect itself. Others viewed them as an obstacle to peace. Ordinary people expressed a blend of hope and fear, hope that international attention might finally push toward a resolution, fear that the renewed tensions could spark yet another cycle of unrest. International media seized on the phrase "murdering Jews pays off." Headlines in newspapers from New York to London, from Tel Aviv to Doha, quoted it verbatim. Commentators debated whether Netanyahu's bluntness was a wake-up call or a setback to diplomacy. Some argued that his words reflected a grim but real security concern. Others said the statement oversimplified a complex situation and risked inflaming hostilities. As the UN wrapped up its session that day, no immediate new initiatives were announced. The Security Council faces pressure to take meaningful steps, but consensus remains elusive. Proposals for new envoys, renewed talks, or even stricter measures have yet to find broad support among member states. What remains clear is that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict continues to test the limits of international diplomacy. Leaders' words, especially when delivered on such a stage, carry weight far beyond the Assembly Hall. Netanyahu's statement will likely shape the tone of the debate in the weeks to come and perhaps influence the course of policy in capitals across the world. For now, the speech stands as a vivid reminder of the stakes involved, not just the immediate political disputes, but the deeper struggle to reconcile two peoples' aspirations for security, sovereignty, and peace. Whether this moment marks a turning point toward renewed engagement or a slide into further polarization will depend on how leaders and their supporters choose to respond in the days ahead. The challenge for diplomats, activists, and ordinary citizens alike is to move past words that inflame and toward actions that can bridge divides. The conflict's history is long, but so too is the history of efforts at reconciliation. In the wake of Netanyahu's dramatic warning, the question facing the international community is whether it can still find a path forward, a path that does not reward violence, but instead builds the trust necessary for a durable peace.
You know what message the leaders who recognize the Palestinian state this week sent to the Palestinians? It's a very clear message. Murdering Jews pays off.